Correct. Okay, yeah, so we're delighted to welcome Bernard Sweeney here today. He is the founder of Travision Foundation. Bernard can talk a little bit more about that. Lizette and I had a talk with Bernard before, and it was really insightful, so we thought we'd kind of open it up to a wider audience. So yeah, I might get you to kick off there, Bernard.
I will. So even despite the fact having a slideshow, you never know where to start because yeah, I'll start with a personal experience. My name is Bernard Sweeney, and I grew up in Sligo. And I guess I have no formal education, no formal qualifications. And I say that not because I disregard education. I see value in education, but I did not fit with the systems of education. When my first experiences at school was segregation, travel-only buses when I was in my teenagers and a little older, it was public services segregation, that we were cut off from the settled people, that there was something wrong with us. So I didn't fit in with the education system. And like I mentioned, it's personal experience. So when I got a bit older, I realized it's not just a personal experience, it's also a collective experience. It was happening to other travelers all over the country, travelers that I had never met, never seen, never even heard of. Were experiencing almost identical experiences that I was. So when I got a bit older, because I became a little more curious, it's one thing to think there's something wrong with you, it's another thing to think there's something wrong with your family, but there's another completely thing to think there's something wrong with the whole entire community. So then when I got a bit older, I went searching for a bit more. I got involved with travel organizations. I helped found and set up some of them. And then I was inspired by people like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, watching other films, documentaries, which was my means of education at the time. Films, civil rights movements, and so on and so forth, films of India. And I was always even weird and strange, not weird and strange, but it was weird and strange that I could almost fit into these other cultural realms, not because I could experience what they were feeling necessarily, but I could almost see what they were trying to also explain. So when it came to realization that it was also an historical experience, because it was happening to myself, it was happening to my parents, it happened to their parents, and it was happening to other travelers just like that. It was happening to my children, and I'm sure it'll happen to my grandchildren. So now we know it's a personal experience, it's a collective experience, and it's an historical experience by an Irish traveler that has no formal qualification or education. And I'm here to do this presentation and hopefully in some way address some of the chronic issues that exist today in Ireland and raise some interesting questions along the way. This is from a traveler perspective. So I don't speak on behalf of other travelers. I don't speak on behalf of NGOs. I've had issues with NGOs, but NGOs have had also issues with myself, because when you have that much trauma in your life, you don't go through life as easy as you'd like to. So yeah, now I'm going to start. I'll try to rush through it. It'll sound like I'm a madman because I think it's quite long. I'm not used to this. I would also like to thank Dylan Foley, a great friend of mine who's here, but also Joy-Tendi and Neasa, who has helped me structure some of this stuff. And then I restructure when they're not looking. I make a hames of it. So this is me. So the question is, and has always been asked for the last 100 years, who are Irish travelers? Now you've got some of the finest institutions and scholars in Ireland. This is the land of the saints and the scholars. You've got sociologists, zoologists, anthropologists, biologists. You have all these fancy names in these departments and these institutions, and they've always been asking, who are Irish travelers? Well, my friends, we're going to soon find out. The history of travelers in a nutshell. To really put it in a nutshell, Ireland as a green little island was colonized by the English, and they had spread, that mentality had spread. We're now in an English colonial form of psychosis, is where we believe this language was always ours and this was always normal, which we know is impossible. And especially if we're on the one channel, we have to recognize there are people sharing this language, but are on different frequencies. And we are one of these people on one of these different frequencies. They call us Irish travelers now, today, but before that, it was tinkers, it was itinerants. They had laws and acts against vagrants. There was the hedge people, we were the wanderers, and then we come up with labels ourselves like tinkers, minkers, pabbies, and so on and so forth. Because something told us that this wasn't here in the now. It had been going on a very long time, And if we were us, whoever we were, we know we weren't the others, and the others being the state. So we can't live in the past, and we can't live in the future either. So a lot of people disregard history, saying, what good is history? We need to plan now and plan for the future. We've got to move forward. And I use these phrases myself. But given that Irish travellers do not come from a settled mentality, we don't think of history in the same way. We are that living history. We are proud of where we came from. We're proud of our people. We might have faltered and flawed, and we might have dropped out, and we might have broken, we might be damaged. But we've been 500 years under a whip of an English colonial environment. And that'll become quite evident. So yeah, we need to literally talk about the present, which is history. I mean, if there was a river and you went down to the bottom of the river and you were taking out the fish because they were being poisoned and you're trying to save them, and you set all your NGOs and your support groups around that area, wouldn't it make more sense to go up the stream to find out what was poisoning the fish in the first place? So we're saying something happened in the 1600s that hasn't stopped. So that's where my focus will be. Such as Trinity College. I've never been inside Trinity College, and I've called out all their lectures and their, I don't even know half the titles they used in these places, because I'm not from there, and I don't want to play ignorant as they're arrogant enough to think that I understand all these systems. But there are professors, there's people with the PhDs and masters and degrees, and they've studied history. They've studied everything, and they're asking us today who we are. Well, I'm asking them, who are they? So we know Trinity College was founded on the ideas of Henry VIII. It was funded by his daughter Elizabeth. It has unchanged since 1922. So it's really Queen's Colleges. Oh yeah, also Maynooth, which is very prominent in the NGO sector. Also Queen's College. The laws that are hurting us today they come from King's Inns College. They came from a King of England. The politics used today, telling us that we should be one way or the other, was the politics of yesterday's, where there were colonial politics. The institutions, every institution we see here today affecting Irish travellers are all English, old English colonial systems now ran by people proclaiming to be the default Irish. This is where it'll get interesting, because Henry VIII came up with the idea of surrender and regrant. And that was to, instead of killing people and causing more genocides, he would break down the Gaelic culture by bribing the Gaels. So we won't kill you, we'll let you keep your land, but you're going to have to do it under English terms. So some of them terms were about cutting their hair, wearing English clothes, speaking English, disregarding all other forms of culture, identity and belonging. And that became a process that started in the 1540s. And oddly enough, I found the other day that the surrender and regrant practice is still used today in Ireland in 2022 to do with land and leases and so on and so forth. And the whole idea around that was the settlement of Ireland. I mean, that's what they call it, the state of Ireland, the settlement of Ireland. They want to settle these wild Irish and make them into civilized people. So they started the process. So they would give them titles like lordship under English rule, barons and so on and so forth. Dylan will talk a little bit about this later, I hope, or else if he disappears, who knows. But all these practices in the education, the customs and the cutting hair and the speaking only in English were centuries old practices. So generations later were born out of them practices, as we as Irish travellers never came from them in the first place. So the time spectrum that we're working off is really between the 1600s and to date, because them institutions have never changed. And we can go well beyond that. We can go well beyond that, because we come from a culture that's very much connected to our psychology and how we would think behind these words, think behind this mentality. And this is why I talk about frequencies. So in 1922, none of this had changed. In 1963, where we'll see again in a bit later, was a report commissioned by the Irish government to settle itinerants, these roving, wandering people who did not want to know the history of us. Made it very clear we didn't look into the history of these people. In actual fact, in the 1980s, when the Incitement of Hatred Act law was going through the Dáil, one of the TDs deliberately amended the bill and had removed any recognition of travellers, saying remove nationality, remove ethnic status, and cultural element, ethnicity, remove ethnicity, and just leave membership of the traveling community, as if you could become a member whenever you felt like it, you can pop in and out. Not like that. In 2002, and no doubt it was inspired by Henry and so on and so forth, without people even knowing it, Like they were doing things, thinking it was normal, but not realizing if you took a step back and see where it started, it was far from normal. And if it went on and changed in 1922, how can you even call that normal? How can you be the normal community using colonial systems against other Irish people? It just doesn't stand to reason. So in 2002, Mary McAleese had signed a bill into what they called the Trespass Law, Miscellaneous Act 2002. And it was deliberately designed to target Irish travellers, no other community. It literally mentions our community over and over and over. One of the things they had said that if we were caught either on private land or public land or in a 5-mile radius of anywhere, we could face prison and various other punishments. That was going back to the 1530s and 1540s when Henry was setting up his surrender ring grant. He also brought in the Vagrancy Act that target these wandering people, these people going around selling knowledge, these fortune tellers, all part of a Gaelic cultural society. But when you flip it on the other side, just like a optical illusion where you see the image one way, then you can see the image the other way. But on one way, these were the vagrants. On the other way, these were a part of a Gaelic culture and society. And this would have brought me into a lot of trouble throughout my life because what I'm saying now was never given to me. This is why I say I don't have qualifications or I don't have disciplines and I hadn't been institutionalized to that degree and programmed is, and my mind had worked differently. I came from a cultural identity. We had fairly systems. We didn't like them. We didn't trust them. And as a child, I experienced that. I was at the back of the class in a special class where I was told I had difficulties learning. I had spent 4 years there. I mentioned the travel bus, so on and so forth, and the other services. So this is a very lived experience. So it got me that I, a stranger and afraid in a world I never made. And this goes back into that trying to fit in. It was atmospherical. It was like it was there forever, that you were not getting past it. You could feel it in the structures and the vibrations of your bones when you're walking through this dense atmospherical hatred, absolute hatred, and people had no idea why they were even hating us. There was something they were hating about us that they couldn't understand within themselves. So we were in our own country and we were strangers, and my God, we were afraid. So this is a short video, a documentary, because TravVision Foundation is not funded. As you can probably tell, I pissed off a lot of people in my time. And unintentionally, I was psychologically wounded as a child. I went through that, never really came out of that. And it was a lot to do with breaking people down, telling us we're this, that, and the other. That you can't go there, you can go there, but you can't go up there. So on support, a lifelong of that could break anyone. And so when I went to the NGOs and I said, look, I think these middle-class settled people, with all respects to them, their sincerity and their loving, caring 9-to-5 friends are psychologically hurting travelers. How can we be travelers if we keep mimicking and emulating and copying this settled system? It doesn't make sense. That was about 15 odd years ago. And I lived through a lot of deaths, including a nephew recently. So a lot of this is deep within me. So I try not to personalize it and I try to maintain myself, but I find it very difficult. So yeah, I'll play this and we'll see how it goes.
Ireland, an ancient land, a land of the saints, a land of the scholars, and the land of Irish travellers. An ancient culture that was almost destroyed by colonisation, but yet had survived. Are Irish travellers the last of that ancient culture? New studies tell us a story going back thousands of years. A story of conquest, resistance, and resilience. Over the hundreds of years of British imperial rule, the resilience of Irish culture was seen as the main barrier to colonisation, and so it was carefully planned to destroy the Gaelic way of life. Irish Gaelic culture was to be criminalised. People who refused to settle in one place were to be arrested as vagrants. Gradually, a new culture and outlook became the dominant in Ireland, that of the settled Irish. My own love had fled. Are Irish travellers, the Gaelic Irish, who had refused to be assimilated? Who are the settled community? and are the two communities closer than we think.
The camping places too, I will inquire all of our people.
My name is Bernard Sweeney, and I am an Irish traveller.
Are signs of you.
Okay, what I might do, if it's okay, if there's any questions, or we can continue, I don't mind. I don't hear anyone, so maybe I'll continue. Okay. Okay, this brings me back. We're still on. People can hear me, they can?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay,
Yes,
okay, so
thank you.
So far, what I'm trying to say is that we come from a culture that's ancient, that goes long beyond even the English name or language, for that matter, which is only 1,500 years old. And we come from a culture that was 1,000 years old. We know cultures change, identities change, and this is not even about we proclaiming to defy anyone else and keep our identity. We're trying to say that there's a balance that needs to be found, that if we're in this environment together, we're sharing this channel, this English colonial language, there has to be an understanding that it is not our language, and there's a good chance it's not your language. So the mind for me is the cultural element. It's the live spark part of us that keeps us connected. The mentality which we rely on for our thoughts and our language and our dreams and our nightmares and our emotions and a lot more stuff going in there that influences our mind. So in the present moment, we have the travelers in the mind part, as are many other indigenous and ethnic minorities around the world, because we do have a common denominator. This colonial mentality language is global. But in this mentality, it tells us one thing or another, it keeps us down, puts us down, and it has given a lot of issues psychologically. Again, very familiar with other ethnic and indigenous people around the world, alcohol abuse, drug use, high levels of suicide, all psychological stress-related illnesses. I would recommend Robert Sapolsky on listening to stuff like that. So we have here, we need to take control of our mind over our mentality, recognize that we are all 99.9% genetically related. And all we could ever really be talking about is psychology and ideologies and cultures and mentalities. But each and every one of us has a mind. But unfortunately, some of us have been corrupted into the mentality of these systems. So here is, this one I borrowed from the net, so I beg pardon of the person I did not mention. My bad. I'll try to find it later on. This one is my own design. As you can tell, it's really creative. Basically, what I'm trying to say is this traveler culture, these others, these that they inherited do not know of, such as Trinity College, Maynooth College, and all these institutions, and the NGOs haven't really helped, not because it's their fault, it's because they've been working on a program that they think it's normal. We're saying it can't be normal because they're still the colonial systems. So how can you tell us what is and what isn't normal if you think that's normal? So this is where the Pale started. Again, Dylan will do some wonders on this, I hope. So the Pale set up its shop, institutions, and we go over here with the Pale again. That was linked directly to England. They had an open channel. They were one of the same culture, identity, and people. Then they had expanded to create 4 shires. And the 4 shires are actually 4 counties around Dublin. And then they colonized that. And then they set up all their local councils around the place. And then 50% of all of Ireland income, I think, GPO, I think, whatever you might call it, goes to Dublin, and the rest is divided among the rest. So we're saying Irish Gaels were once outside this Pale. And what's left of these Irish Gaels are Irish travellers. This does not exclude other people with Irish surnames. It doesn't exclude native Irish speakers. It excludes absolutely nobody, because we're not taking anything away from anybody. We're saying that we say we are Irish Gaels. We can prove it. We've lived it. We are living it. And you can say you are, and then we just ask you, why are you not being targeted by the state? Why are the same colonial systems not attacking you? And you'll come to the conclusion it's because Irish speaking or not, you're in a settled environment, which was once a colonial experiment and project of the English. This is not to get alarmed or get scared by. It just means we can own our own mentalities. We can own our own language. So that was what happened, in my opinion, with Dilean can add to that, hopefully. This is the 1963 commissioned report into itinerancy. And itinerancy, again, one of the many labels that were put on these Irish people, because genetics tells us we go back thousands of years, centuries, and we know our culture is very identical to the culture that Dilean would have told me in around the 1600s, around clans and cultures and traits and various other parts. Travellers are still literally living out these practices under immense psychological strain, as you can see in all our statistics in a few moments. So the 1963 report, whether or not it was good intentions, because with their best intentions, it made it look like a military exercise. Now this, in 1922, we'll go back a little bit, sorry. In 1922, within the first 6 months of the state of the foundation of the state, they issued a kind of act and law against these nomads, they were calling us. And they must have to call something. So these nomads, these people living on side the roads, that was their first target. That was in 1922, 6 months into an independent free state. So when we talk about mentalities not changing, well, that's a perfect example. So in 1963, they did almost a carbon copy of the 1600s about the settlement of Ireland. But in this time, it was the settlement of the itinerants, and they were going to do it with the best intentions, and it was going to hurt them as much as it was going to hurt us. That's so much so they left us out of it. They included all the state departments, all the heads of departments, guards, criminal justice, education, health. All these departments were now going to decide the future and the fate of travellers. That led to decades of segregation, institutionalized abuses, segregated homes that are very similar to what you find what happened in Native American lands, Canada and in America, I'm sure. The other parts of the world, these institutions where they're beating the itinerants out of us, to get our inherent ways out of us and to protect the settled people. Always protect the settled people from the people going around selling knowledge. So the results of all of what I'm talking about, the history that hasn't gone away, the history in the present, is that traveller women live 9 years average, 11.5 average, less than women in the general population. Traveller men, on average, 15 years less than men in the general population. Travellers have 6 to 7 times higher rate of suicide in the general population. This is an Ireland that already has an 18.5 overall mental health issues, higher than most of Europe put together. But we still surpass that by going 6 to 7 times higher suicide rate. The HSE, who were a national health board to help travellers and support travellers and help everybody else, because travellers are just human beings. There is no such thing as travellers' rights. It's human rights with variations. So the HSE sending money back that was allocated for mental health use, it's not being sent back. The local authorities, who also are returning funding that was ring-fenced and allocated for travel accommodation, sends that back. So they're wondering why we're dying and dropping dead all around them. And everybody's scratching their head and wondering what can they do to prevent this. And here we have state agencies, almost a form of systematic genocide, because they are cutting off life-saving supports. So sometimes we have travel organizations.
I'll let you have that goals and what the feedback is or whatever.
The traveller organizations blocking travellers and the denial of the circumstances caused by colonial institutions, including travel organizations. This is where it's got me into a lot of trouble and landed me best part of 20 years in no man's land, without work, without any chance of getting it, because I pissed off all the organizations when I had mentioned about the settled people's mentality, that I think it was affecting travellers way back then. So this is not a criticism of travellers, because this could happen, and it has happened and continues to happen, that if you're born into this environment and you think it's normal and you become accustomed to it, well, that will become your reality. That's why you'll see various different organizations, and even the people within them have a psychology of the organization. You can see this in military type people and doctors and solicitors and so on and so forth. They have almost changes their habits, their body movements, and create these traits. That's why I believe the psychology, the power of these organizations can do to people. The NGO ones were the 9 to 5 Gandhi, sell me, help me kind of people. No disrespect to Gandhi or anyone else. It was a savior complex because they believed, all intentional purposes, that they were the default Irish. So if they were the default normal Irish, the civilized Irish, well, then it would make sense we had to help these broken people and we were going to fix them. So we told them to do this and to do that and show them this way and that way. They showed us what was actually done onto settled people for centuries. And that was that form of a colonialism syndrome. So again, from all these are statistics. I mean, when I look at these, I can't help think of all the people in my own lived life that I've seen died at young ages, nephews, uncles, mother dropped age, grandfather was murdered, people went uneducated, alcohol abuse, drug abuse. This is the life I would have lived up in seeing. So it's very difficult even to look at these and think, not to think of those people. But 11% of all travelers died by suicide. 10% don't see their second birthday. 50% don't see their 39th birthday. So half of all travelers, 18 is middle age. 70% don't live past 59. Only 3% live past the age of 65. Again, this is not blaming anyone. It's nobody's fault. It's a colonial system. You inherited, as the politicians would say. Well, you also inherited the mentality of the systems because that's what them institutions were designed for in the first place. So this is not a physical issue. We're not physically downtrodden. We're not an unintelligent people. I come here with no formal education or qualifications. I can still hold my own with the most qualified of people in there because I can draw on the common sense knowledge that these systems are not even Irish systems, let alone settled people systems. So if they're not them systems, I think we need to talk about how we can improve them, change them, tweak them, because I'm not blaming people. It's not the NGOs, it's not the settled people, it's not the middle class, it's not even the politicians, it's not even the elites, because they're all on different bandwidths of a colonial environment. This is one of the guys who had definitely inspired me the most. And I only got fragments when I was growing up on TV because we didn't have access to education. And if I was in a library, I wouldn't have made no difference because I couldn't read. My reading and writing only came a very recent thing. So Malcolm X got me into a lot of trouble also. That's when I decided, yeah, that makes sense. Them white liberals he's talking about are the same middle-class people in the NGOs. And again, not criticizing them. They're wonderful human beings. They've been doing their best 9 to 5. Some of them have spent decades in positions of power without ever leaving them, while our people are dropping dead all around them. They're the parts that hurt me, but they're the parts I can't blame anyone because this is a system. So I'm going to play a Malcolm and then I'll continue.
Will ever do to bring about true, sincere citizenship or civil rights recognition for black people in this country. Nothing will they ever do. They will always talk it, but they won't practice it. And with the Supreme Court, if the NAACP can tell me that they want a desegregation decision for me 10 years ago, but yet the schools haven't been desegregated, as I say, this is a victory with no victory. It's a victory that you can talk about, but it's a victory you can't show me. So if you represent the NAACP and you are telling me about this great victory you won for me, when I look at you, I have to conclude that either you have been duped yourself or else you are trying to dupe me. And in most instances where the civil rights struggle is involved, there is no civil rights leader can point to me one concrete gain, practical gain that black people have made in the civil rights field in this country, not only during the past 10 years, but during the past 100 years.
Yeah, in the last 100 years, which is interesting because now we're in the centenary of celebrating 100 years of Irish independence when they ousted the old English empire. Them ships definitely had sailed, but it would seem their equipment and their systems had stayed put. This is Malcolm X talking about something that we recognize even today. Remember, this was 1963 and it's still happening in Ireland. 1963 report. When Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were waiting a Supreme Court ruling to overturn segregated systems, in Ireland, they were about to commence segregated systems. So you can see there's a kind of a link, there's a commonality, similarities, and when you pop into the English linguistic family, well, you're into the mentality of global colonialism. Again, it's not blaming people. We see it now more than ever, and it took me a lifetime to figure that out. So yeah.
ever do.
So Malcolm X also talks about they will talk the talk. And again, the middle classes and then the engineering of travelers, because even when I was involved, it's a case of, aren't you amazing? You're wonderful. You're great. You're astonishing. And to give these travelers the most finest of praises, which is absolutely nothing wrong with it. But then they put them in positions where they're not qualified to talk about. They put them in political positions, making decisions in our life that we now know that has had a negative impact, because Malcolm X saying, show me one game, one win. We can show the NGOs their own stats, their own figures, and say, look, there's our losses. There's been a constant decline in our mental well-being where we did not have these issues in the past. So the tokenism, where we hear a lot of organizations, well, I had a black person on, I had a traveler on, there was someone gay on, there was someone, as if that somehow or another is the inclusiveness. And that goes back to almost a subconscious fear-based thing. Let's now tokenize them. Let's pick the most similar people that are like ourselves. In actual fact, if we're going to include them, let's create an environment and a process that we designed out of colonization so we can understand them better without realizing that they're conforming people into a colonial mentality that loses their own sort of identity. So to tokenism, we have a traveler on the committee, on the board, we are being inclusive. And most cases, we've seen, and this is when I say the word genocide, people might think that's a pretty strong word to be using in this day and age with Irish travelers. But what else would you call it? We went through many genocides, many famines, many issues. Our history is with us. We're outside this colonial system, so we can say it the way we feel it. So what happens is they cut these people off. In most cases, they're cutting off democracy or a person that holds no voice or disconnected from the community. So they're bringing people in without any self-election, without any self-appointment, without any self-representation of the real needs of the people, and are performing them on settled platforms. And this is what they call tokenism. So again, if it's ticking the boxes, they'll tell us that we've allocated so much funds to travelers. We are inclusive. Millions has been invested. There's no getting away from it. That's why I can't blame the people. I can't say that Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil or these political parties are evil inherently, people that want to destroy the people. From what I can see most times, some of them are genuinely trying, but themselves are getting logged in or locked into thinking whatever reality is, because they believe they believe themselves to be the default Irish. So the problem has to be with us, and that's the way they see it. So you got millions in investments, still 50 years of mental health getting worse, much longer, but 50 years since the first travel organization went up. State agencies such as the HSE, which is National Health Board, and the local authorities sending funding back, where most people have no idea where it even goes. This is a class of systematic genocide if it was to be seen in different countries. I've no doubt about that. Assimilation, again, from the 1963, the exclusion. So again, you have the NGOs, but now they have it in a way, it's inclusion, but it's inclusion under terms and conditions like the surrender and re-grant, abide by the law, the customs, traditions, learn this, learn that was pre-programmed for people. So that's assimilation, surrender, and re-grant. The traveler can be supported as long as they give up their culture and fit in with the norms and become a Garda, get a PhD, all within systems that were designed to change people in the first place, the settlement of Ireland. So NGOs are paid to increase the health and mental health of traveler community, but the mental well-being are decreasing within the communities. So what we get for our 100 years of independence, and when people celebrate and kiss me, I'm Irish, and kiss the stones and your Gaelic and your Celts and all that wonderful, beautiful things, we're saying enjoy it, love it. It's a wonderful feeling to have. But we're also saying in that 100 years of unchanged colonial abuses, 60 years of systematic segregation and abuses, 50 years of travel support groups, and we are worse off before any of you guys came near us. And these are just facts. So when you ask us, are we the others and the outsiders and we're different, we're saying, no, we're not. How could we be the others when we've always been here? How could we be the outsiders when we've always been here? How could we be different when we're the ones that never changed? So these would be questions for the institutions to ask themselves if they're Irish and proud and they're land of saints and scholars. Well, I'm calling you out, my friends, for a friendly conversation, and let's talk about these issues. What is inclusion? Well, I guess this is what the whole idea of TravVision. I hope I'm not ranting on, my friends, but yeah, this is what the whole idea of TraVision Foundation was, to create an understanding, awareness of mentalities and colonization. That if in some way that we could do a psychological reset and say, look, we now know what this thinker is saying, and he's saying things that are unsettling for a lot of people, because your most finest educated scholarly people, we haven't seen them. Your academias reminds me of our ancestors who were mercenaries, but our mercenaries stayed around to the end. These guys come in with the long words, cripple our community, put it into a system we cannot reach, and will not translate it for us, and will not come around us afterwards. We need to deal with that. So we're looking for a autonomous project development. In other words, we're not blaming and we're not carrying the shame any longer. You might have broken us many, many, many times, but we still got up, and we're 1,000 years old, and that's who we are. That's our culture. It was also once yours, and we would like to give it back to you. But you will have to start listening to people that you don't understand, because what you do understand at the moment did come from 500 years of being bombarded with. So cultures, developing self-determination of Indigenous people's rights under the United Nations law. I mean, if this was any other country, if this was Russia, if this was China, this would be a global story. This would be an ongoing genocide that's centuries old, 1,000 years old, and they still haven't broken down the Irish travellers. So that would be our wonderful, glorified version of it. But we're not here to blame or shame people. Like I said, I mean that. We all have to, because a lot of people out there that do have Irish surnames. So it makes sense you came from our background. So psychologically diverged, I would say, rather than genetics, because we're 99% related. Culturally appropriate training that isn't tokenism. And again, it's doing that. We are in a crisis, but yet many times even the travel within the organizations will get behind campaigns such as the act of bill or law around history and culture, and they'll lobby one thing or another, but that's as far as they go with it. That's as far as they seem to can go with it. There's still something missing, and they're not quite sure what it is. And I'm hoping that they, more than anyone else, will take a step back from the NGOs. Don't give up your job, don't give up what you're doing, but to learn to see it the way you should be seeing it, and a way we can revisit it, I guess, or revision it. So creating systems of knowledge and business enterprise drawn on our own culture. I was hoping the TraVision would be that kind of unique type, I don't know about unique, but different. In other words, it was created by this mentality. It came from our cultural understanding. It didn't come from settled people, it didn't come from the institutions or the middle class people, it didn't come from the settled environment whatsoever. It doesn't mean it's going to be completely alien. It isn't going to be something that's going to harm or hurt anyone. It's an actual, again, blending it all together and improving these systems, because we're not out to destroy the systems, overturn the systems, or inflict any hurt or pain onto anyone. And when we have a good record, when you think about that, all of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, spent telling travelers how settled people feel about us, that we should do this and do that, and we wonder why we have so many issues. But have you ever once seen a report spent or used or published where we feel about settled people? Because we don't have the same feelings of settled people as settled people have for travelers. And that's a generalization. We know there's bits and pieces in there. An openness to participation of other Indigenous cultures, including settled people, as it's outside of the mentalities we hope to go. So again, settled and travelers are two labels. They were born out of colonization. But when it wasn't travelers, it was itinerants and thinkers and all these other labels I mentioned. The settled one only goes back far as the 1600s. Why the 1600s is very important. It's that time spectrum. There, something happened. Here, it's still happening. It doesn't matter beyond and beyond that. It doesn't matter in the middle of it. We're talking about there and here, and we think we can fix that. And ways forward. Again, these are rough ideas, or not ideas, but rough slides. I did nothing to do with Joy-Tendi or Neasa. I just butchered things. So ways forward. Again, the past, the present, and the future all happens here in one moment. If you can take a step outside of that, the past and the present and the future looks a little different. You see it in a spectrum. Like I said, the 1600s, you can go anywhere you want. If something happened here and it's still happening here, at least we know what's caused it. We can address it. In 2016, the travel documentary DNA, which was my lifesaver, I think, because I was literally at my ends at that particular time. It's one of these stories where you kind of hit all the different rock bottoms, you go through all these different things, and then something happens. I've heard the story many times, sometimes you disregard it. But would have happened to yourself. It was definitely a case like that, of that my litter ends. I wanted out, done with it. My mind was fried. There was absolutely no one around that could understand this, even talk about it, address it, and you would have everyone telling you that you were kind of gone mad. So in 2017, because EU had threatened to take the Irish government to court unless they addressed the discrimination against Irish travellers. Travellers are formally recognised as an ethnic Irish ethnic something, and I'll go into that briefly, because recognised was a symbolical thing, as they said themselves. No changes in the institutions or the constitutions or the systems and the laws and so on and so forth. Why would they? They didn't know how to do it in the first place, is my opinion. So basically, we got recognised as this ethnic minority, which is okay in terms of trying to fighting for who you are in a complete environment that you were submerged in, that nobody knows who you are. So you're really trying to hold on to who you think you are. But we're not an ethnic minority. We are an indigenous people. I'll give you one quick example. In America, where people were taken from the African continent and used as slaves, were classified also as an ethnic, a people without a land, a people from a different land. When the Roma come here or there or anywhere else, they are classed as people without a land, they are classed as an ethnic group. Indigenous Native Americans is Native Indigenous Americans. Why? Because they came from the land, they emerged from the land. Irish travellers are not an ethnic group. We're an indigenous people. We emerge from these lands. When I talk about mentalities and so on and so forth, in 2002, the Supreme Court has overruled the 2002 Mary McAleese signing in one that was a trespass law. And it was a great recognition. It was kind of, they recognize themselves as something not right here. They're saying it's like these people from the formation of the state have been fighting for ethnicity and cultural rights. And somehow or another, I think it's something to do with our systems. They hadn't said that, but I'm pretty sure they are aware that exactly what it is. So that was the McDonough Supreme Court, the first case won against the council to say that their home and land is based on the ethnicity and culture and the unfair treatment by the state. So that was a great recognition. Travellers are indigenous cultures of Ireland and are part of Ireland's history. When people say that we've no written history and that travellers were always a nomadic people and they were once called thinkers, there's elements of truth, but there's also elements where it cannot be true. It depends on which way you're looking at it. If you're coming from the institutions like Trinity College and Maynooth College, well, that's what you'll see. You'll see minute forms of something that resembles these people that are looking at here today. But when you come from the traveller, Gaelic, Celtic, Irish mentality, you see it completely different. Because everything that looks minute on one side was part of a bigger, broader system, mentality, culture. It was a society. So we see things differently. It has that optical illusion of colonial optical illusion. Where in the settled world realm, you'll see it one way. And if you're a traveler or someone else from another community, you might see the same thing differently, or it'll mean different to you. That's based on our mentalities and our cultures. So yeah, that's Travision Foundation. Better understanding. Yeah, sorry. Travellers are indigenous of Ireland, blah, blah, blah. I'm great, blah, blah, blah. Intervention in human rights organizations. The United Nations, as maybe it's our perspective that helps bring better understanding to complex global issues. Again, this will never take away from anyone else. And this is not to say it's all, yeah, we understand now. When people want to talk about the slaves, slavery, white people, I wouldn't even dare try to speak on behalf of anyone else. It's not. But what I can say as a human being that's 99.9% genetically related, that we also have cultural connections. We also have an indigenous mentality. We think differently. We feel differently about the world we even live in today. We have a common denominator. This colonial language was born out of other colonial elements throughout Europe. The English language was constructed up of other countries. It was a systematic language, which would explain the global economy. This is an institutional-based way of thinking. So when we say indigenous and settled, we're not talking necessarily about the people, we're talking about the mentalities, because I believe everybody can step outside of just about any mentality they wish. Solutions. Oh, sugar. Well, solutions, and I have some of them out. Access to platforms. You're hearing this narrative, and you might think I am absolutely bonkers. I think I would have a better chance throughout my life if I had told people that I was actually a time traveler and not just an Irish traveler, and I would have convinced them. I would have told people I was Jesus's brother, and I came back and I want to catch up with people. I would have worked better. But when you're seen as absolutely other and nobody, no qualifications or education, there's no possible way that you can be saying these things, thinking these things, unless you heard these things. And then you explain, yes, of course I've heard these things. These words are not mine. This is not my language. It came from the institutions and the people I've met and the things I've learned along the way. I'm a fan of Noam Chomsky. I'm a fan of Robert Sapolsky. I love the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, Angela Davis. I'm a big fan of Mark Charles. I'm a big fan of human beings in general. So I'd only learn a little bit about something because I've already lived through a lot of this. So I don't need to learn a lot about something that I've already lived through. That sounds, well, however it sounds in the settled world, where I come from, it sounds like common sense. Why do I need to learn all these things and study all these things? I'm telling you basically to what's exactly what has happened, and I'm asking you to prove me wrong. So the solutions are access to platforms. We want to share our platforms with everyone. We've nothing against the government, the state, the settled people, the Anglo-Saxons in Dublin, or call themselves the settled Irish. Come out, lads and ladies, or whatever you want to call yourselves. We've no ill feelings with you. Times have passed. We're not 100 years ago. We're different people. We're all a more intelligent people, and Stephen Pinker will even say that. So I would say let's have these conversations, as difficult and as challenging as it might be, but it might go a long way in understanding how we might create a united Ireland, because you can't have a united anything if you cannot unite the people. I think what we're doing will go a long, long way in understanding colonial trauma, intergenerational trauma, and the trauma that has never ended, and the denial of trauma, such as helping settled people understand that their trauma of denial by thinking and believing and acting as if they are the default Irish within a colonial environment, using English systems, acts, laws, and policies against Irish people, telling them that they're others, they're uncivilized, and they need to be civilized, and they have to be institutionalized. And that was a genocide, because there's men, women, and children in our community right at this day are dropping dead. This is not to tear on your heartstring to make you feel guilty or to oblige to do something. I'm saying that you, whoever you are, beyond your label, beyond your occupation, beyond your name, whoever that you part is, this is a part where you can step outside this mentality in the same way I'm speaking about it. You don't have to go into a traveler mentality or somebody else's mentality. You just need to step outside of this environment and look at the origins of its pillars of colonization and institutions, and they have gone unchanged in Ireland. Wouldn't that explain for a lot of the issues we're having today? Wouldn't that explain for a lot of the mental health issues that Ireland's having today and around the world? What if we could turn this and change this and begin a new beginning and say, look, we got it wrong. We understand the white element and the black element and the brown element, and we understand that the racism and anti-racism, we understand it because they're all within a time spectrum of the 1600s to date, and they all come from a colonial mentality. Racism and such things did not exist in a Gaelic culture. Malcolm X knew this. Von Fontaine, I believe his name, the French Nigerian philosopher, recognized this, and he was a pretty strong advocate and had strong, wonderful feelings. So all these people recognize there's something. Karl Marx recognized this, and I'm not even a Karl Marx reader, but I like watching YouTube videos, surprisingly. But that was my means of education later years. And if this guy talking about Karl Marx wasn't saying what he knew, he was saying there was something else beyond capitalism. There was something else behind capitalism. There was something else he couldn't understand. So I would take snippets like that, like the guy Hitchkins. He would say something like very short, and this is my education. He might say, it's not what we think. Anybody can have a thought. It's how we think. And this is where I think tradition is coming from. It's how we think. And how we think cannot be anything else but linked to the institutions and the education system and the laws where they make our children go to school or they put our parents in prison. These are all unchanged colonial systems. So if you're going to be Irish, show some of your Irishness and let's do it together. A traveller assembly, let us, for what's left of us, the 0.7, I think, population of the general population in Ireland, where once we were Europe, we were the Gaelic cultures and societies. And just like Christianity, where it's got 33,000 different groups and 33,000 different opinions, they are the one mentality, but they can also be very different. Travellers are pretty much even like that today, what's left of us. Some of us came from different backgrounds, but we all came from a Gaelic beyond the 1600s world. And so we come with different names and different locations. It's because that we are the survivors of that world. And I know that'll be a lot for people to take in. An online traveler university that allows, again, to build what's left of us, to take what that last bit of who we even think we are, even if it sounds crazy to everybody else, and let us develop that, let us nurture that, and let us do it in a way that we are inclusive of everybody, because we don't need to exclude people. Community enterprises. I would love to see travelers practicing the arts and the crafts and the music and all the things that we know we can do, and all the things that have been taken from us for hundreds of years, let alone the last hundreds of years. Who inspired the Dubliners? Who inspired Christy Moore and all these wonderful singers? They were borrowing and taking and got songs from our community because we couldn't get into the shops and the pubs to sing them. So maybe they thought they'd do it. Decolonization. Some of these are long words, so I don't even know half of them. But I know it's something to do with, again, the mind and the mentality. That if we can trust ourselves to let it all go for a moment, our beliefs, our religions, our politics, our identities, our ethnicities, everything, just let it go for a moment and analyze it with the mind outside of the mentality. Because our mentality has been usually influenced, including me. I'm speaking in this language, but I know it's not my language. So I'm hoping we can do a decolonization. And there you are, my folks. I hope you survived.
Thank you very much, Bernard. That was really stimulating. I don't know if anyone has any question for Bernard and for Dilean as well.
I'll just briefly introduce Dilean so people get a heads up. So just going to introduce him. He's a good friend. He's a good guy. He's one of a couple of other people that are really into trying to make TravVision work, because we don't just see it for travelers. We don't exclude the native Irish speakers or any culture. It's just not the way we think. He's also an archaeologist, so he has great field experience. He's a historian. He's an artist. He's into comics. He's someone that when Marvel gets sight of him, they'll actually recognize that they're onto a winner. So over to Dilean.
Yeah, well, you were saying if people have questions, I mean, work away. Like myself and Bernard often do things, not today, but we often do things together. So it's just a case if there's historical question or whatever, but I won't go on to, I won't say too much about what he said. I don't think I could say it any much better, I would say that I would say briefly that one of the keys there of what he's talking about is that it's interesting, if people think about it, that we have that we have these two types that we call Irish people, settled Irish people, or travelers, that there's two types, you know what I mean? That even we have to designate Irish people as settled. And if you think about that, it's one of those kind of clues. It's a bit like settled, a bit like in the Wild West, settled Indians or wild Indians. It's very much colonial kind of idea. So it gives you an idea of Ireland, really. The Wild West, for example, in America, it's kind of a continuation of Irish history in a way. And so you can kind of see that everything Bernard's talking about it kind of fits into that world. So yeah, we do a lot of work on that, but it's, I let people, if anyone has a question, or there might be there was a lot in there.
Dawn had a question there. So what do you see going forward, or how do you resolve this situation? Like you said that, your kids, Bernard, and then their kids again, maybe experience the same thing. How do we stop that in more immediate sense, I suppose?
This where it gets tricky, because I remember when I was younger, I was very egotistically sure of myself, till I decided one day I would borrow Malcolm X's and a little bit of a Paula Ferreira, I think his name was, and I couldn't understand that much of it anyway. But I decided to tell the settled people, look, I think your mentality is hurting us. What happened was they kind of pulled down the shutters. It scared people or frightened people. So I ended up in a very, very excluded place. And it comes to that point when you realize that this is very institutionalized and systematic, that if people were born into this or born out of that, how can we truly blame people for their actions? But I think how can we address and how can we, there is no simple answer for it, and I don't have it, and I wouldn't want to suggest somehow or another that I would know what's best for somebody else when I know I've lived a life what I didn't know is even best for myself. And I think it's about creating an awareness that if I don't know and if somebody else doesn't know and we all don't know, that's a good place to start from. Because from what we see so far, everybody who tells us that they know has resulted in 50 years of decline of mental health. So we know that something isn't working and we're not sure what it might be. So I think TravVision would be encouraging these people, whoever they might be, to come forward and engage with us.
And how do people actually engage with TravVision? Like, can you signpost where to go? Is it Twitter? Or what's the best way to kind of stay in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. The TravVision Foundation is on Twitter. As you can probably sense, and again, this is well, it's what I'm saying. And I think if people really tune into this, because if they can go behind the person and the label, they're hearing another human being telling them that they are in some way in a deep state of colonial psychosis. That the people who are asking us who we are haven't a clue who they are themselves. I don't mean that in a disregarded way. I'm just saying this is the process of a very long process of wiping people's mentalities. TravVision is trying to center itself and found itself in a way that's kind of safe for people, that we're outside of the labels, because we have a historical connection, we have a global connection. And I think about celebrating the arts, but putting it away and bringing it into a way that does not, it doesn't damage anybody. It doesn't, yeah, it'd be better for mental health, I would imagine, for everyone, as opposed to, as opposed to dogging into it and trying to tell people we know what's what and we're going to stick by this. We're flexible. We're trying to learn. We're trying to understand. This is the best we've come up with so far. It's work in progress.
There's another question as well from Guinness. So, hi, Brenda, thanks for the talk. I have a question about the proposal for a Travellers' Assembly. Would you see it set up through IRIS in the same way as the citizens' assemblies, or is that format viable, or is it exclusionary or too settled in its focus?
There's nothing in terms of, say, we're going to do the opposite. Actually, I did say that a few years ago. I said, if we're to get out of this, we have to do everything opposite of what the settled people are doing. When I say settled people, right, I want people to tune into this part also, because there isn't a day in Huz. We are on this island, a small island, and we are genetically related. And if you're of the Irish Gaelic background, you came from our old world. This divergence we see is genetic markers, not genetics, just genetic markers, blue eyes, brown eyes, so on and so forth. That goes back 360 years. So that was when the conquest started. That's when the divergence and the breaking down of the people. And then we have got genetic markers that goes back 1,000 years. And people are trying to figure out where that might have come from. And even when a traveller community census, we would say, well, that would make sense because not all clans would just marry into anyone. They would strengthen their power by marrying into other clans. And travellers, even my lifetime, would have done that. So whatever we do, I suppose, it's not to say that we travellers are different from settled people. We're saying we are travellers, because you called us travellers or something else. We're saying we're Irish Gaelic people that would like to establish a Gaelic understanding of our own culture, identity, and bring that to life. It isn't anything strange or alien.
I would say a word there just to say that it's very, I mean, it's not even controversial history in the sense that all you're saying there, Bernard, is that the state, people sometimes, we know our history, but we sometimes forget what the implications are, in the sense that the state in Ireland, the state and the laws in Ireland were built by the English colony. Now, there's some complexities to it because it's so old that it's embedded into a culture, you know, it's embedded as part of the culture that we now call settled Ireland. But if we went back a few centuries, what they would call, the English themselves would have said that there was civil Irish and wild Irish, you know, and that's the modern form of it would be settled Irish and travellers, for example, or, you know, as Bernard says, the labels change over the centuries. But we would say that the simple version, though, is that we don't tend to acknowledge or delve into in this day in the modern Irish history. We don't go into it enough, the sort of fact that simple fact that the laws were created and the state itself was built by England that had its own agenda. And that's straightforward. I think when Bernard mentioned earlier, I would just very briefly say that the court case that Bernard mentioned was the first time that when the Supreme Court, just there in, I think it was in January or February, when the Supreme Court acknowledged for this family, McDonough's family, I think in Clare, and actually made a judgment that acknowledged that their caravans that were parked on illegally on the side of the road on a certain bit of land that belonged to the council, but that they could actually extend protection of the Constitution to that as a home, which had never been done before. And the judge in his judgment said that for 100 years, Ireland had failed, since 1922, that the laws had failed to acknowledge travellers as an ethnic minority, and that other forms, as Bernard has said, that other forms, even of how it's manifest in the sense of like what's a home, and can it be different to what the law says it has to be? You know, can it be mobile or can it be, you know, that kind of thing. And so that's the first time that a law was made that they said, okay, we can extend that. These are caravans, they're mobile, they're on this bit of land, but we can extend protection as a home because we acknowledge now that the law, we understand the law was actually made on purpose to stop that way of life. And therefore we're going to have to make a change because we know about the history. And I think that's everything that's behind this, is that we and Bernard, obviously, as he's explained, is that going into the history in order to go forward, that if we don't understand a little bit about it, we can't really change it in the right way. And so, yeah.
I think that was one of the things that it's because it's a lived experience. You take it in differently, you think differently, and you can connect it. I mean, that only comes naturally. So there wasn't a case where I've caused a lot of frustration. Because I remember a few years ago when I was going to talk about mentalities, these were fellow travelers and organizations almost mocking, telling me, go back to your book of knowledge, and who's telling you to say this, and where are you getting this from? And then the travelers were saying, well, if they're not saying it in Trinity College, well, then it must be true. I didn't hear any of the experts saying, and I'm going to ask this, and this made it almost impossible, because we didn't have, when most of it, we didn't have the written expertise to produce, we didn't have the certificates. But it was also a realization that the power of the NGOs, that it was influencing travelers to start thinking that the answers couldn't be anywhere else unless they came from the settled people, that the solutions to our problems couldn't be found anywhere else unless it was Trinity College or Maynooth College. And these were the people that were going to help us. And what I was trying to say, which I wasn't doing a very good job most of my life anyway, was saying that these people, their best intentions, are producing some of the worst outcomes, because they're trying to get us to think like them, as opposed to promote our own way of thinking. And there's that awkward silence.
Does anyone else have any questions for Bernard or Dylan?
As part of this, I know it's going to be kind of a difficult pill to swallow for some people, because if you've lived your entire life believing that you're one way and this is the way it was, because even the way I see it is that this class system that was designed by the English, what you now call the working class, the middle class, and the elites, I mean, that's centuries old practice. Each one on that level sees the world as reality. They believe that is reality. I just think we got caught up in a lot of different systems, because what the NGOs were doing, and no criticism, is what they were emulating the same systems that were oppressing us. So they were almost recreating other mini class systems out of the system that was oppressing us. So it was kind of a loop we were getting caught into.
I would say that happens when you're unconscious, when you don't, exactly when you're not going into the history. I'd say that when you're dealing with IADT, because this is IADT, I think it's interesting, Bernard, if you were to say why there's a bit of a focus on the arts, though. It's a bit like with the question what people are asking, what do you do to deal with this? So one thing is history. We do that to deal with the sort of like, how did this end up like this? And how did this, who built that, and what is it we're dealing with? And that's fine. But going forward, we think arts is very important. And I think Bernard does as well, in particular, that the expression, even of the history, and also of all people's expression, and what Bernard talks about with mentalities, I think all artists understand that that idea of seeing things differently and mentalities and being in the same, seeing the world differently, even though you're in the same space and all that kind of thing, is really important to artists and people like that. Maybe you want to say something about it, Bernard.
Yeah, well, I remember, I think it was helping you actually, Dylan. I think it was G, the lady's name, wonderful human being, Scottish. It was a Limerick, and they invited down for a talk. But again, I'm just dog rough in terms of sometimes presenting the social graces and norms. So I was trying to explain the mentalities, and I said, I recognize it. I can see it. I see it far more easier in other cultures than I would see it in the dominant culture. But within the dominant culture, you'll see it. And these artists have it. It's almost they're trying to peel back the reality that they're within. What's beyond this? What's above that? And they're always trying to escape that. So the way I described it at the time was it looked like they were constipated, which probably wasn't the best thing to be saying at a talk about artists. But it had that frustration where they looked like they just wanted to get out. Sorry.
Remember the Matrix, Bernard? We used to analyze it on the Matrix. That was one of the ways of looking at it.
I remember the first time, like I said to you, when I was a child, again, it's a very common thing for a lot of children, 5 or 6 years of age. You have this kind of level of, I think it's called plasticity. It's like a chemical in the brain where their curiosity is high. Well, I had that all my life almost. And because I didn't have the structural education to go with it, it just collapses you in on yourself because you're trapped almost in your mind, surrounded with a mentality nobody can understand, nobody can relate to. So I've been the best part of 20 years like that. So it brought me into a lot of messy places because you can't really function without a qualification or certification or an education. And my problem wasn't even just with the education, it wasn't just the Anne and Barry books telling me this is normal, big house, tricycle, 2 cars, mom and dad look all grand. Anne and Barry came from England. This 6 years of age was doing my head in. So I had this kind of outside of the colonial mentality, that experience. And a lot of people get this because I'm hoping that if you are that person, you're thinking this stage or some part of this, that actually he's not even talking about himself because he did mention that it was a collective experience. And he did mention it was an historical experience and it's a very human one. So I believe a lot of people feel what I'm saying in their own versions, in their own way, because what I'm talking about is human beings still hanging on outside of a colonial mentality, a colonial environment that seems to have escalated and exploded in many regards. Because again, from the outside, I can take a snap of Rome and say once upon a time in Rome, there was 3 elements. There was the military, there was the religion, and there was the privateers. I can say right here today, we can say it is the companies, it's the government, and it's the church. If channels like that can continue to last and traditions can get passed down, well, then it's very much common sense that oppression can get handed down and trauma can get handed down because they're in parallel systems. I might be wandering there a little bit, but the idea is to say that it's about meeting of the minds outside of the mentalities, because it isn't about my mentality or your mentality. It isn't about which one is right and which one is the best. It's about human understanding to say that there's something flaw in all of us. And if we can recognize some of them flaws come from your institutions and your systems, maybe there we can change them. I do rant, don't I, Frecht?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any other questions. If anyone has any other question, because I feel that we need to kind of wrap it up now. Thank you very much, Bernard, for coming. Thank you for all the talk.
Thank you, Dylan. And thanks to everyone for attending.
And just a final note to finish off on it, again, because
Yes.
it's watched by travelers, or it's watched by politicians, or maybe Michael D. Higgins is loving this. I bet he is. Is that, you know, I think don't shoot the messenger. This is a very unique narrative and perspective that developed from a traveler, developed in Sligo. It's not being talked about anywhere. We come from a community where the statistics should tell you we are literally dropping dead, and we come without formal education. So wherever I manage to muster up these words and create this version of our reality, I would like to think it's something that's worthwhile, because I had spent almost 40 years of my life trying to understand this and got me into a lot of trouble. It's not because I'm trying to sell something to someone or convince someone. I'm just saying that you guys have togged us for decades. You've took away our family and a lot of deaths, a lot of misery, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain. And we're saying that we believe you got the history the wrong way around. We're not the outsiders. We're not the people who are different, but we're not the one who are judging people. So with that, I hope Travision breaks down a lot of these labels and colonial stuff.
Well,
Thanks very much. Very well said.
And
Thank you.
very much, friends.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming along.
Thanks everyone for participating. Thank you for your support. Hopefully Berna will keep in touch again and see how we can take all this, we in this together. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
thanks.